Hello everyone, today we talk about the tripartite social order in the Middle Ages, which is definitely a very fascinating yet fairly controversial topic, chiefly because it's a historiographical interpretation that has kind of fallen out of date for valid reasons. I believe I approach it from a relatively, objective and neutral point of view, but never that considers the thing in pretty balanced terms. Yet I find it extremely interesting and particularly also useful to make a bit of to reflect at least on certain aspects on medieval civilization. So I would like to start from the very the most explicit source in this sense, or the most effective in such a few words. That is a quote from Adalberon of Laon, who was Bishop of Laon. He was born in the mid-10th century and died around 1030. He became bishop in 977. He participated to the political struggles tied to the rise of the Capetian dynasty in the French kingdom, and siding, in fact, with the Capetian, the first Capetian Hug, who was to begin the dynasty fundamentally as a crown in the French crown. So among this, there was a very strong struggle in France for the rise of the dynasties and the monarchy. So this quote is not just, this background is not just anecdotal, because obviously this source has to be read in a political and kind of institutional way, even in a propagandistic way if you want, and it was to influence in this sense, if not taken, mediated and filtered and contextualized also by later historiography, probably in ways that were not really the real ones conceived at the time. So it's definitely a view of the world and the social orders, as we will see, that reflect the so-called tripartite segmentation of society, and this is drawn fundamentally within the scripts of the Carmen ad Robertum Regem, which is a dialogue in Examiners, which is fundamentally sketched and outlined this theory of tripartition of society, right? And there it goes. I'm translating very, very simply, almost paraphrasing, I would say. And here it says, in this vale of tears, some pray, other fight, even some other work. And the three categories, the three orders, are they stick together, and they do not suffer. They can't be, in fact, separated, disjuncted, so that on the function of one rest the work of the other two, and all three of them ensure aid to each other. So this is a very meaningful phrase that naturally the script it's much long. Also, a lot of other things have been written afterwards, but this is very effective way of putting it, and that especially in considering these three orders fundamentally as part of a unique body, right? And the fact that they basically are that they all need each other. They are all functional to the whole. This is a very these are not thoughts that definitely were born at this time. Obviously, this was a time in which Western philosophy was slowly beginning to accelerate, and but these were concepts inherent to the same to very old times. This was obviously a Christian conception that the Trinity brilliantly also exemplifies. This is something that the same Christian Trinity has definitely connections with the old Pythagorean Trinity or the Platonic one, so albeit in different ways naturally. So this idea of three in one that make the whole perfect fundamentally. And so this was a bishop. Always remember that at this time in history it was the clergy was virtually the only educated estate, if we we want to call in this way, or order or class, or whatever you want to, that also was naturally and heavily soaked in these conceptions, knew how to make an argumentation, to make it effective from a rhetorical and dialectical point of view, etc. And this was stemming, in fact, from one of the most important bishops in the Western Frankish Kingdom. So this is the portrait, fundamentally, of, according obviously to Adalberon, of European society around the year 1000. So at the dawn of the full structuration, consolidation of the feudal system, of course will keep growing and developing and transforming for many centuries, but that at this point was really such a common and uniform and homogeneous system, social system and political system and institutional system, and from which the same monarchies that were rising at this time in Western Europe were drawing their political practice from. I made several videos. If you go into the medieval society playlist I've made about, I don't remember even the titles now, but if you look feudal for Schwerpunkt, feudal monarchies, etc., you should find that for a bit of context if you're interested. So having said this concept of the three functions represented by the three estates were obviously to represent, as we just say, and they reflected in some way the earthly order wanted by God. So in other words, they were to reflect the divine perfection on earth, and at the same time they were those elements that granted, as we have read, harmony within society and societies, because always remember that at this point, of course, there is still very strong and alive the concept of universalism that dominates all the political, at least in the feudal world, in the empires, in the post-Carolingian empire, etc., the whole idea of what the world was to be. But also, this was still a very fragmented society where every kingdom was kind of very difficultly trying to rise, from this set of local lordships that had formed after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. And therefore there were several societies. So this is a very fascinating concept, because you can see perfectly how in medieval society there is, from one side, universalism and in this sense absolutism in the neutral sense of the world. These monarchies wished to be absolute, like they would become in the modern Europe, because as a matter of fact at this point they didn't have that power at all. But there is this particularism that effectively regulates, especially at the local level, the life in the society, and we will see that it's exactly this particularism that makes us wonder and reflect whether this theory is correct and it's a right interpretation of those times. But obviously, like in this very broad topics, the truth lays a little bit in the middle, so that you can't really lean towards the extremes, but a fair conception stands on a mid ground. Societies in this sense, whichever they were crossed by such tripartite functionalities, and these were represented by the three estates that in Latin are very famously the Oratores, Bellatores, and Laboratories. So it's very simple. The singular would be orator, bellator, and laborator. And they mean simply those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Oratio is the oration, the bellum is war, and the labor is the work that now we say it's more than just work. It's something that effectively covers a wider. It's like a like an exertion, and a strain, an effort, and we'll see that partially. In fact, another element that brought to some criticism to this interpretation is that even for medieval mindset, these three estates had definitely something in common in terms of what they did and how they did it, and sometimes there was even they overlapped even from a strictly social or institutional political level. But we'll see it now. So to the Oratores, so to those who prayed, and we're talking obviously about the clergy, expected to pray in order to maintain this stability and this security and safety of the Christian world. So this is also a very big topic that we will try to address maybe more thoroughly. I made a video about the Liturgy of War that takes partially into consideration what the prayer even was meant for. This was a time of a lot of wars, a lot of conflict, a lot of violence that actually stemmed at this time, especially around the year 1000. The second invasions have stopped. So actually at this time, especially before the Crusades, Christian violence was mostly directed towards within the same Christian world, so that not because it was Christian proper, but because it was that society that so politically fragmented, so institutionally difficult to regulate. So there's actually pretty massive problems of we can't really say of real public order, because also this kind of violent approach, like saying, these were such bad people who slaughter each other just for the taste of it. It's not very historically correct, in my opinion. If you go look what violence was aimed to in this context, of course, you notice that war entailed a big deal of pillaging, violence of all kind, rapes, slaughters, etc. Even let's say slavery / serfdom was a thing still at this time, and the we know what humans normally do during wars. But if you look at the political in this Clausewitzian perspective, the political aim of these actions, you realize that the logic and the intelligence that guided these wars was pretty strong, was iron solid. Like it's never about we can't be impressed by the violence of these times, but if you look through the eyes of those people, you would realize that it was all functioning because of certain they weren't justifying that. They were actually condemning war, and it was a reaction within the same Christian world to these violences. But these violences were carried out for political actions that were aimed actually at creating order, not destroying it. This is very important to remember, because there is all a propagandistic approach even to the matter. The idea that there were bad Christians that fundamentally robbed, and they were kind of like marauders, etc. Especially these errant knights that stayed there, these cadet sons of the noble families. They went around pillaging, etc. Well, is a very monarchical. It's an observation made from a strongly monarchical perspective, because at this point, in fact, the monarchies were trying to emerge as a kind of a ruling. As overrulers within all these seigneuries. The case of the Capetians, as we were talking about before, is a brilliant example where fundamentally, especially in France, the monarchy was virtually non-existent, especially in the periphery. There were these great noblemen that were sometimes even more powerful than the same Western Frankish king. But what is important here to remember is that the same lords were doing in turn not just, okay, let's destroy everything. The king wants to create order, civil order, well, no, we will destroy it. No, it didn't really work like that. What they wanted was basically to create the order under their own guidance, under their own power. And if you look at on a perspective, on a long perspective, you realize that this effort brought to something. It brought to something also, and paradoxically, and maybe not so paradoxically, but into the loss of freedom of many other estates. This was a moment in which feudalism was accelerating, and feudalism was effectively the concentration of an enormous amount of wealth into the hands of a very few people. That obviously extended their power also with violence, with deterrence, and you see that by the 11th century, many freemen in Europe were still enjoyed as a relative, autonomy, a relative wealth. With the consolidation of feudalism, you realize that the masses go, especially in the countryside, that still the wide majority, the overwhelming majority of the European population grow poorer and less capable of organizing themselves, even politically, etc. In relative terms. I mean, to what it was before, for instance. Not that was a perfect freezing of the political autonomies. This is something that actually started happening towards the very end of the Middle Ages, not at this point, but definitely feudalism accelerated this process in the centuries we're discussing now. So the idea of that however, the stability of the Christian world could be achieved through prayer, so towards this moral tendency, fundamentally towards a religious observance and fear of God, and trying to, of course, embrace the essentially peaceful Christian message, and regulating society for which everybody could be safe more than else. It was very important. As a matter of fact, the same monarchies that were being formed at this time were had chiefly a military task. That was the one of pacifying, and this could be like a kind of a double-edged sword. It according to the perspective, because sometimes pacification meant, as we were saying before, loss of political autonomy. So these are different ways you can observe it from. Although I must say I mostly lean towards the other side. I mean, I believe that after all, there was a progressive, pacification. We can't say, especially at the local level. So it's not that the locals during the following centuries suffered necessarily less, but it also depended on where they were, which kind of, it's obvious that if a kingdom strengthens, it is able to deliver more force in one place. So, if you live at the frontier between France and England in the following, let's say, France and the English dominated territories, the Anglo-Norman territories, you realize that maybe that was not a great place to be. Maybe not also many others in the kingdom, but still the idea of the creation of a more central or political force of organization, etc., embodied by the monarchy, was a process of civilization. It's very relative, it's very controversial, you can see it from many perspectives, but the Middle Ages kind of grew. There was a kind of an improvement compared to previous times in some ways. And even though definitely resources and wealth were distributed in not necessarily equal ways, but still there was a general improvement. And much of this actually passed, and especially in the Christian world, I believe, in Western Europe, through a fair balance, in fact, of the prerogatives of the various estates. I mean, the great losers in this were the peasants, but as we were saying before, at the end of the Middle Ages, Europe remained in many ways, for reasons that now are a bit difficult to explain, that have to do with probably the Indo-European background, the kind of environmental conditions that had brought to societies to develop with a kind of balance between the freemen and the aristocracy, to always claim, okay, we're still freemen. I mean, that there is not this great, I don't know, like in other places like China, where there's this great theocracy that we're kind of annihilated by, individually speaking. In Europe, what the popes did was something pretty much more secular in this sense than in other places in the world, and after all, it was a kind of a fair balance. And the order, the tripartite order, is something you effectively find until the French Revolution, in the Ancien Regime, broadly meant, extending in some countries far beyond the French Revolution, of course. It was a way to represent all the various social stands that in one way or another, especially in these previous centuries before the 11th century, had kind of started defending their own prerogatives by right, by the way, by law, because they think about the same common law, for instance. It's something that in there is pretty eloquent how the customary tradition of the in that case of the English freemen. So we're talking about people who weren't noble, who weren't necessarily aristocrats. Then, of course, if you look at the process of how the Magna Carta, etc., were produced, obviously we're talking still about oligarchies, aristocrats. But still, there was the recognition of a fundamental and original freedom of the individual, and this stemmed both from several roots. Actually, that there was the Germanic one that naturally stressed freedom for as the average, at least for freemen, in fact, that there was kind of the grade zero of society. Then obviously Roman law that contemplated equality in the sense of all the Roman citizens, and that in this Roman right was still living in obviously, even if modified, then it was recovered, especially starting from the late 11th century. And also Christianity, that added the idea that fundamentally we were all equal in front of God, so that there shouldn't be, at least hopefully, differences, political differences between men, even though the world is kind of unfair, right? And obviously, these factors were important to build up a fair balance, after all, considering what medieval standards were also elsewhere in the world, let's say, and to remain in some ways at the base of Western civilization, after all. So the clergy was meant to basically to be the speaking soul of society. The one that was entrusted with, in fact, with the closest connection with God, and therefore praying for the salvation of humanity and of the social order broadly meant. Here we have quoted the example of Adalberon of Laon, that especially in France, that the monarchy had since a very early time, even in the Merovingian period, this very strong connection with the clergy, with the Kingdom of France. This was probably the most evident of all, even more than in others. But it was true also for other kingdoms, including the one of Germany, the one of England, different measures. But it's important because here there is not just a universal salvation, but there is also a kind of a narrower scale interest and allegiance, let's say, towards the local rulers that, in this sense, were building even a sort of religious mandate that they had, let's say, in a Christian perspective, as chiefly as military leaders. At this point, the kings, monarchs, chiefly pertain to the Bellatores group, so those who bear arms. Monarchs were meant to be warriors, fundamentally, be fighters, Christian fighters, of course, and that had to use the sword to enforce peace, because this was the ultimate end. So the orator, and we'll have to talk, I think, a lot about on Schwerpunkt on. Even if we analyze this from a military point of view, it's very interesting how the feudal society revolved completely around this um, the military guidance, in many ways. Also because fundamentally the greatest expense of this time were about war, and in order to field even a single knight, there was a whole society working for it, aimed at basically at a common goal. So this theory, this tripartite social order, is not really just an abstract theory that it's been invented just because it sounds kind of nice. No, it really reflects, really stamped from a world that saw the effective existence of these three estates and their cooperation, and a very close cooperation actually for a common good that naturally could vary depending on what kind of chiefly political entity we're talking about, but that was also to look beyond the universal level that is the one Christianity is thinking about constantly. So passing to the Bellatores, in fact, this second had to fight. They had to fight. That was their only occupation, and I stress their only one, because at this time, in the 11th century, what you see the feudal elite emerging as a self-aware, self-conscious estate that knows about his privileges, is extremely proud, extremely warlike. He also builds this very prepotently this social certification for which they felt to be really the best guys around. Their mindset was, telling the truth, not very religious. These people were, they were all about religion as well, but it's not. We don't have to think that they actually knew much about it. If you studied this time in history, you realize that most of the theological understanding was extremely low, and it was at the limit of paganism. These were worlds and societies that still were entirely pagan up to like a half of a millennium before. You can't pretend with the means of those times that these people had changed mind. Even in the 13th century, if you read the work of Jean de Joinville, that was now a 13th century France. Now it's a very advanced stage of medieval civilization, very structured, fully Christian, and you realize that even in there, the contractualistic mindset of the pagan world were still there. Even prayers, at a certain point, Joinville says, what do I pray God for if it doesn't make me win? That was the mindset. So very far naturally from what we know it is Christianity from a deep religious and philosophical point of view, but it was believed in that way, and it helped in many ways. Christianity was a glue that favored also ideologically this system to stick to, making it stick together, and it was very important. But their mindset of the fighters, of the Bellatores, was chiefly about war, because the feudal elite is born for just one task, that is war. This is how it's began. And it was a military professional elite. There is no other way to put it. These people spent literally their whole life, or at least the good season, on horseback fighting, and also because at that point, given the climatic, problems they had to necessarily stop military operations, and starting every year, and it was all about that. This is how knighthood and chivalry and military professionalism, etc., was born in this world, and these guys had to fight. And naturally, in this tripartite order, their task was to fight for a Christian aim, fundamentally, for the defense of Christianity, first of all, because even though there are several interpretations, but fundamentally the Christian concept in here was always stressing the if not the strictly defensive purpose of violence in the Christian world, but at least something that could be justified by a good cause. So this was a time in which also theologically and politically there were lots of there was a renewal in the studies. This theories of just war were being kind of better articulated, structured, etc. At the end of the century, the Crusades will be launched. So you realize that at that time, and the very strong, even the Crusades in many ways stemmed from the concept of tripartite order, where you have an estate that is fundamentally all about war, and it's not about war because of its taste, because of its lust for violence or for ambition or etc. It is about war. It is armed, sword in hand, because God has wanted that. God has wanted this Christian society to be protected by someone. That is not someone just the first person who can bear arms. In this sense, the feudal society was naturally praising and loading with great values the ideas of chivalry, and therefore the single knights and were seen as this elected models of championship, of valor, of fealty. The same concept of fealty, the oaths of fealty in the feudal world were deeply tied to the religious morality and morals and practices. There was born naturally also on the Bible. There was a great very strong military ethos tied to Christianity at this point in the ways it was seen. And this was naturally the product, and as we will see now, of a society that required necessarily those activities. We don't have to think this was a violent society because it was a medieval society, it was a Christian society. It was what it was because of pretty, inescapable reasons at that time. And naturally, from an ideological point of view, these activities were, trying to be justified and motivated in order to also trying to channel them better. A great problem of the 11th century, especially from these greater principalities and kingdoms that are emerging, is in fact to channel all that habitual violence towards kind of more to larger goals, including the Crusades, for instance, and therefore getting rid also of a lot of violence that effectively was ravaging in the Christian world to direct it somewhere else and make it kind of a positive use from their own perspective. And then and naturally the Bellator was to obviously to protect the so-called Societas Christiana from the enemies, not just of the faith, but of the enemies of Christianity proper. That is also evil people, right? So it's kind of at this point, the feudal elite is effectively everything. It's army, it's police, it's politicians, it's government, in fact. And so you understand how pervasive this violence could be, even independently from whether it was used in defense or attack, or within the borders or outside the borders, etc. Whatever you meant by them, by the way. Then, talking about the third estate, the Laboratories, obviously, the Laboratories had this, always remember that this a single, this whole system could not work even without one of them. And in case of the Laboratories, of the workers, you realize that their main task, it was fundamentally probably the most important one, was to maintain and to support the other two orders through their own labor, through their own work, and this naturally, it was mostly about the peasantry, especially those at this time. The feudal society is also mostly a rural society, despite cities are starting to revive. But we'll see it later. So the term labor, from which laborator actually comes from, indicates exactly not just work, but as we were saying before, this physical exertion. strain, effort, right? So something very physical. Just think about the Benedictine monks that called for, their motto was ora et labora, which means pray and work. And among the work, they also contemplated things like writing manuscripts, because it was effectively very difficult, very tiring to write entire books, etc. So it was a sort of I don't even know how to say that in practice, but it was a budding work, like a work that was bringing effective wealth and richness, and it added something more, something positive. Even if, at this time, definitely economy didn't progress at very, as you understand, very fast rhythms, but it was still believed that that tiny thing that could save was so important. And this could happen both from the prayers from the clergy, like another thought, another reflection, another step closer to Jesus was felt to be maybe the measure that could make us deserve grace and redemption. For the fighters, it was about making the very last to fight till the exhaustion of forces to defend as yourself, the whole society. And for the workers, to work that more to till exhaustion, to have the tiny more that you could use as a reserve, that you could treasure, that you could invest into something else, and to make society flourish. So and this is how it really worked, also because it was a very materially grounded world at this point. As we were saying before, the greatest expenses were the ones related to the military, to maintaining knights, and knights consumed an enormous amount of resources. Just think about how many farms it took to make work in order to provide an armor, a coat of mail, or to feed a war horse. And we at this time, even a single battle so concentrated such a huge amount of calories that took arguably generations to produce out there in the field, because this was mostly a survival rate economy, so that the fate of entire countries was decided by this tiny surplus, by this tiny effort. And if you look even at geography, etc., you realize, especially in the early and high Middle Ages, how precious was what you really could save. That even if it was something so small, but that something was precious and you had to use wisely. This was the idea. So talking about the term ordo in Latin, or ordines, it's the plural. So it is basically mean the order, literally, of course, but it's like the estate, in fact. And we mean it, in fact, in its meaning of social body. The corporative metaphors here were all over the place, meaning that the whole society was seen as a great body, and every subdivision was considered as such still, and the whole Christian world was seen as a great body where ideally, in fact, all of these systems had to cooperate for the good of the whole, right? And in fact, the term that we usually indicate as religious order, that is like in the monasteries, etc., this ecclesiastical organization with its own rule of life, was expressed at the time as religio in Latin. So literally how we use the word religion today. So the same term religio in Latin basically has this etymology of tying together, something that has the same etymology of of keeping together fundamentally, and to relegate in some way, but in a positive sense. Um, so the this I think these vocabulary aspects are kind of important, of course, and this repetition of the duties, of the obligations, definitely also corresponded to a precise division, a subdivision of work and of wealth. So looking at the picture, how that society was, like, this was a society essentially born for defense at this time, and based on a economy of survival, into which definitely agriculture was at first place, and therefore it was natural that the work, that the labor, was conceived in an essentially servile, or maybe subdued form. I mean, as a sacrifice. This is particularly important because even certain moral appreciations what we do about that word, what was such a dark time where peasants broke their backs in the field. Otherwise, yeah, of course, there was definitely things like oppression. There was definitely something like inequality and sufferance related to that, and definitely that world was aware of it. We don't have to think the medieval world, well, that was normal at the time. Therefore, people were happy to suffer, to be serfs of someone else, or to work at their corvée, unpaid services for their lord, etc. But at the same time, if you look at from a broader perspective, you realize that world couldn't work in any other way. I mean, if this form of organization, of course, there could be a different distribution of wealth, but it may as well be that this distribution would have created more problems in terms, especially of when it came to defense, military defense. Feudalism was strengthened, was formed in its and developed in its not really its full form, that it's even difficult to define, but was brutally accelerated, let's say, during the time of the second invasions. It wasn't only about that. I mean, definitely that the situation, even second invasions, we have discussed them often on Schwerpunkt, came fundamentally as a consequence of internal collapse of that of the continental society for how it had been built. But it's without doubt that because of the civil wars between the various Carolingian, post-Carolingian powers and the second invasions, this society had grown, especially in the 10th century, strongly militarized, and since it had been brutally brought not really to the ground, but almost, let's say, in the general delicacy of the productive structures, etc., in all these wars definitely brought to great promise. Society had in some ways restarted from this eminently military base, because that was how they had been built from the basis, right? So you can see that in this outer centuries, starting from the 11th chiefly, when there is this revival, reprisal, definitely there is also a crisis of a certain type of feudalism that that is expressed paradoxically by the same rise of the feudal monarchies, because the feudal monarchies had surpassed the particularism. They were trying to broad everything, to centralize in some fashion, to control what before was of someone else, and where there was basically no center that could extend its reach over them. So this also stemmed in part from a transformation of society. So that this term, this ideal tripartite society was basically already anachronistic by the time it was now celebrated, and meaning that it was probably truer before this. And there is a great debate, and now we will see why it was created, and this, talking about the anthropological origins of this division. before feudalism in itself and what was happening now into the European High Middle Ages. But the broader perspective is important. There is also this idea that circulates that is very incorrect, which is history as oppression, right? As we were saying before, oppression was definitely there, but at the same time, you look at here at this world, and the nobility, the aristocracy, wasn't being born because of much of the oppression that eventually was able to exercise, especially the more it went on. At the beginning, it was literally the same communities that entrusted part of their freedom to this aristocracy because it was the only one who could defend them, who could ensure them kind of security, safety. So this was a perfect social contract when two contractors were perfectly kind of more or less on equal grounds, let's say. So the idea that there had to be someone there, sword in hand, who had to defend the territory, to control, to ensure security and enforce security, etc., was fundamental for this war. This war knew what the cost of war was, the cost of violence was, and some of these people preferred, in fact, to become serfs from freemen that they were, because the only alternative would have been to starve to death, or to be killed by some martyr, and that was it. So the vassalic beneficiary system, the feudalism, as the consequence of this need for protection, that the vassalic clienteles were able to provide for the local communities that were never at this point fully enslaved at all. This is not the Middle Ages. It wouldn't be even in other moments. There was always a certain degree of autonomy, but slowly there was even the stratification of this system, and therefore the let's say a sedimentation, a consolidation of this system, and the social certification that was a consequence of it. But even in here, never by the argument that the nobility was just a bunch of thugs that cared only about treasuring stuff and eating expensive stuff, or going around with dressed in such expensive clothes while all peasants starved to death. This is not how it worked. All the surplus that was drawn by the aristocracies from the peasantry was constantly reinvested on the territory, even the same agricultural works, in a manner of expansion. At this time, there is nothing like these guys. I have this all this grain that I don't know that I took from peasant work. I just keep it away or take it for me to kind of, I don't know, to do what. It was always reinvested, and obviously there is there was a very important a role in here covered by supplies and stocks and reserves. We talk about this, but these were so vital because they were rare they were a rare commodity in the first place, and since famines were not such a rare eventuality and wars could destroy the whole thing, having these stocks, etc., helped to cope with emergential situations. The same lords obviously cared about the peasantry because the peasantry was the working force, and if they didn't have the working force, the lords couldn't have anyone who supported them. So there was a great care actually for even the worst lord of this time, the most evil and wicked individual, to actually preserve the community that they controlled, because it was all about them. These communities in theory could even call for someone else to come defend them, protect them. So the myth of the classist mythology that these terrible aristocrats of the Middle Ages were just a bunch of parasites that enforce with violence their power, it's absolutely false. Violence existed. It was all over. It dominated this world, but it was always based on very solid logics that had to do with the expansion of their power, the consolidation, the structuration of something greater, something better organized, something expansive, by the way, that could, in fact, create much more civilly ordered political entities. In France, at this time, in the 11th century, you see the rise of the emergence of very big and powerful territorial lordship of kind of provincial, if not regional scale. Well, regional in English means something much bigger, but provincial scale, there was something pretty powerful and big, and you can't argue that, in spite of all the war that sometimes these same lordships definitely and constantly carry out to enact towards each other, still within this systems there was a general order, a general pacification at least, and even if this went along with in parallel with the progressive impoverishment of the freemen, of the middle classes, which is not true obviously for everywhere, especially in the cities that were rising as well, still there was a larger system growing. So whatever you want to call it, see it from, it's still something difficult to even to understand probably for our mindset, which is not absolutely to justify obviously all the lack of of real justice, of it was a terrible world to live in, and don't get me wrong, but it couldn't really work in many different ways at this point, and it was the norm pretty much everywhere. I mean, this has nothing to do with feudalism in itself at the time. Basically, all the societies that we see at this time in the world, they are about an elite that basically behaves like mobsters. That's it. That's everywhere, literally in every single land in the world. There is someone who controls, who protects, and enforces justice their own way. They don't want to be bothered. They want to respect. And this is, it doesn't change really up to the emergence of the modern state, where there is a central institution that starts progressively to draw away power and it starts to monopolize political military control, turning into the states that we live in today, starting from the 19th century. They called Napoleon, etc., the birth of the nation state, where the state is the only source of law, because, as we were saying before, every community at this time had its own law. This is also pretty interesting, is that the first experiments, in fact, to create something more universal and state-like start with the recovery of Roman law, that instead was it kind of worked in similar ways actually, but it stressed something, a much more centralized and sound central order, that this is what all these various dynasts in high medieval Europe were craving for themselves, for their lineage, for their house. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So constant investment, and not many other ways to increase power. There is also this kind of metus hostilis factor, this kind of military perspective. You can, if you were born in this world, you would soon realize that you didn't have many options sometimes, but to be violent and to go to war, because even if you didn't want to, if you didn't act in that sense, you would have been choked and swallowed by someone else pretty easily. So in a sense, you had at least preventively potentially be armed, be capable of striking back, and this was a a necessity for everyone. I mean, even the same peasantry was militarily organized at this time. They very often the seigneurial armies were full of peasants. Peasants at this time were incredibly aggressive, were extremely violent. The myth of the poor peasant that is such a gentle soul that stays there, and then arrives the terrible lord that oppresses them. The peasants basically, as much as they could, they kept doing the same exact things, because guess what? They are human beings like everyone else. But peasant violence was something incredible that kept existing for a very long time. Thinking about the Jacquerie in the 14th century, just now, if we're talking about France, peasants were the peasant history is a long history of abuses, of oppression, of violence. But when they were untied, were unrestricted, where usually there were massive defeats, like that made temporarily the central power evaporate. Like, in fact, with Jacquerie, the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the French king was captured. The peasants went literally wild. They started slaughtering, destroying a blind force. And that, by the way, this brought I made several videos about this now, and this brought to their same loss, however, because they were not organized. They represent this very violent and force that broke out, but was soon repressed by more structured systems that existed out there, like, in fact, the feudality and cities, etc. Consider also that the relation with money. This was a society where money didn't really circulate that much. The Carolingians, like all big empires, had tried to re-inject a bit of currency, etc. But until, in fact, the 11th century, 12th century, money circulation was not so much, at least, especially in compared to, to the Mediterranean, the Islamic world, that was much more dynamic at this time. Now, progressively, the tides turn. By the 13th century, it's Europe that has the upper hand in trade balance, which means that they started having more gold than the Muslim world had. But by this time, this was a largely rural world, as we were saying, right? So it was all based also on barter, on this kind of natural payments, etc. And therefore it was kind of normal that the church started to have some suspicion. It started growing suspicious, dubious, and therefore also starting to consider condemnable the same money exchange, because the theory was that especially considering the interest rates and all the stuff like that, it was considered as a sin, because all that was a fruit of usury. Every type of earning of earn that was not directly acquired with the sweat of and exertion, etc., was looked upon with reproach, and therefore everything the usury was banned, and the same trades were kind of usually either left to non-Christians, like Jews principally at this time. And there was a lot of hypocrisy into this, actually, because as long as economy started rising, let's say, and this kind of loans with interest were were practiced on a regular basis. There were ways to kind of mask that, to hide it. The idea is that from a strictly Christian perspective, you don't have to get an unfair deal. I mean, literally everything you give is what you have to give back. Naturally, this was all conceived in a strictly biblical perspective from the words of Jesus, etc., that are metaphorical, but still pretty eloquent, pretty clear on this. So every gain that you had in more compared to what you had given in exchange was considered a fruit of evil, of the devil. That's the reason why so many merchants, for instance, at the moment they tried to get rid of everything to save their souls, because all the wealth they accumulated was felt to be a sin, and this also reveals, in fact, how that society, and we're starting this from a kind of an ideological point of view, but it's that's secondary. That's kind of superstructural in many ways. The reason why this was the general mindset is that the one we were saying before, that as long as society survived only through reinvesting continuously, it's obvious that treasuring and accumulating and amassing money for not using them was considered negative. This was considered negative even in the pagan world. As long as the pagan world was it kind of worked with in that fashion. In ancient Rome, in Republican Rome, the most powerful Roman families, for instance, that were considered to be kind of immoral if they didn't constantly reinvest their wealth, because otherwise society could not work, and there was a lot of effort even to make this luxury being spent. Sometimes later, especially in the empire, where these families, the senatorial estates, began to produce so much, because they just wanted to treasure and not to invest and to give space to the middle classes and trade, if not of luxury goods, etc. So also all monetary problems now that were happening. But it's important how this was also ideologically reflected, of course. So this concept of the tripartite social order has been, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, interpreted in many different ways by not excessively different, but let's say that there were some interpretations of it that went far enough to be debated, as especially in the second half of the 20th century, this great philologist and history of religions, of mythologies, if you want, Georges Dumezil, who had elaborated this general theory of the Indo-European societies. Now, if you Georges Dumezil is one of the best reads I've ever done. It's an author we'll have to discuss because it's been somewhat forgotten, or at least in some milieu, because of his alleged political orientations, etc. But we value him as just as a historian of religion, and I think some of the best books I've ever read are from him, and they're amazing. And obviously they have this mostly this kind of religious historical perspective. I mean, they're books about the history of religion, but they tell so much about anthropology and about culture broadly meant, etc. And this author elaborated this theory, for which so by Indo-European peoples we obviously meant those societies, and this, especially these linguistical groups that emerge from the great migrations of peoples, presumably coming from the Eurasian steppes that invested Europe in the second millennium BC, and not just Europe, but also the Caucasian area, Anatolia, Persia, the Indus Basin, etc. that, according to this theory, would have fundamentally, or at least recognize a sort of trifunctional repartition of society as a sort of common supporting structure, right? And this is a very controversial theory that is being fueled by especially some this is especially most typical Vedic India, the idea of the castes and all, but there are also other reasons for this, but today we tend to dismiss it because from an anthropological point of view we know that it's, first of all, it's very difficult in the first place because we know very few about these populations in the first place. Secondly, these populations kind of modified themselves. Even the same Indo-European migrations didn't occur all in one time. All these peoples entered in contact with other populations that had different beliefs, different structures, and kind of modulated themselves accordingly. And especially it seems that, I mean, in a deeper perspective, that it's very difficult to even talk about things like estate, like an actual repartition of society in three, in fact, precise castes. Probably the case of Vedic India is more meaningful because those were populations that came to, in that case, the Aryans came to rule over peoples that were kind of more advanced already, so that they could dispose more, let's say, in a more dirigistic way, let's say, in different chunks that were destined to the various, elements of society. But if you look at Europe, the Europeans, but in that case, this is not so evident. I mean, it's obvious that ancient European peoples had things like, okay, there were warriors that were fundamentally all the freemen were considered warriors. So this is also interesting to imagine. I mean, there wasn't really a warrior class as such. The workers were the slaves proper, because the Aryan freemen didn't work. They just fought, and all who worked were slaves. But we know that as soon as the Aryans settled in Europe, of course they became because they were semi-nomadic, at least. They became sedentary. They mixed with local pre-existing populations. They started obviously working the land. So even this idea, this kind of primitive model for which the warriors have just to move and to be at war and not to have just a farm or a piece of land to work for the family, it's something that it's difficult even to point out. It's obvious that the closest, I'd say the poorest the society is, and the more there is this tendency, at least in a very highly militarized context, to stick to that model. But even in there, where's, for instance, the religious estate? I mean, where are the priests proper? If you look even at very primitive populations that in old times, like especially the Germans, or you realize that there wasn't really a real clergy, a real priesthood. I mean, everything was much more shaded, like soft, and there were definitely priests and religious figures, but there were mostly some kind of elected individuals who were believed to have a particular relation with a particular sensitivity. I mean, this is typical of all tribal peoples, and actually these repartitions actually seem to, with the real classes, start into other populations that are more stratified, in fact, where you have actual classes. And in fact, you see, I don't know, in Mesopotamian civilizations that were not Indo-European, at least in part, they weren't, there was a class of priests, there was a class of warriors, there was a but it was, even in there, it was kind of very blurred. But especially the priesthood, was something much more defined. So this interpretation is extremely controversial, and as a matter of fact, it really doesn't hold, right? And there is also another perspective to consider, is that usually the Oratores, since we're talking about the medieval tripartition, is the class that is the most educated class, right? It's the one of those who have not necessarily have to write. Obviously, in this historical context, yeah, of course, they wrote, etc. But however, they are the depositories of knowledge in a way or another. In the older times, it was all oral and sent by heart, so that they passed it on generation by generation orally. But obviously, especially when they sedentarized, the populations began to write, began to have that kind of approach. And so this knowledge, this wisdom was considered kind of the highest form. That's why the priesthood, in this sense, was and those who prayed in general, was probably the most important and sacred element of the wall. It's an ideal in the scale of values that comes to the closest to the celestial majesty, that is, of which the clergy is a medium for the other orders. This is indeed something true. This existed in the ancient civilizations. It was felt as such, but as we were saying before, it didn't necessarily stem from a real, actual tripartition of society. It's actually more, even in the Middle Ages, in this way more stratified society than the Indo-Aryan was back in the day, where you have the clergy that for certain reasons came to be the only one who could write, who treasured, who wrote things down. But it's also in here a very different approach. Obviously, you can't stress, as you stress the differences, you can also stress the similarities. So remember before when I was saying, for instance, that the warriors this time were kind of still like with a pagan mindset, albeit in high medieval Europe they were nominally Christians. But the same goes for the priesthood. I mean, we can't actually fully know how much of the older pagan mindset was preserved also in here. In this idea of that the prayer was something that went beyond. There wasn't just maybe just an individual and very intimate and that dimension that all the that every Christian can have, but just something more, that the priesthood, in virtue of its alleged holiness and election of some sort, could better employ in communicating between the God and mankind. So it's difficult to tell. Definitely, as we know, Christianity drew heavily also from the ancient pagan religions, from the same even from the same Aryan perspectives that weren't, after all, so enormously different from the ones of other populations. And in the essential, I mean, the celestial deity of the sky is something that you find in so many cultures that you don't have to look for. So there are many parallelisms and definitely influences that that same pagan past had brought into this, but not necessarily the specialization, in my opinion, this tripartite function. That, in my opinion, is much proper than actually very stratified societies. I mean, you can see it from feudalism in itself. For instance, what about the difference between the Bellatores and the freemen? I mean, originally all the freemen were warriors. It was so among the Romans, it was so among the Germans. At this time in feudal Europe, you have instead now a class of impoverished people that you basically, there maybe are freemen on paper, but they're effectively servants that not only they do not fight but they are prevented effectively from fighting because they're disarmed, because the Lord takes away. They just have to work the land, and you have now a real warrior class that is the feudal elite, the military elite, and that does only that, and it is a true class of warriors at that time. So this has nothing to do with the with the Aryans of the millennia before Christ that came over this, that invaded these sedentary peoples and obliged them, they enslaved them to work for them, and kind of keeping this warrior practice that eventually faded, and as the Aryans mixed with the local populations. But paradoxically, in this social stratification of the Middle Ages, you have the same thing. And the interesting thing, in fact, is that the peasantry wasn't conceived as non-freemen in the medieval world at this point. But it is true that now the feudal elite started to conceive itself in something that went beyond that started in somewhat replicating the this relation master-serf that in origin the Aryan populations had done. I mean, the feudal elite at this time thought that they were kind of the masters of the world, the rulers of the world, chosen by God or by their province for their strength, and some contempt towards the peasantry were starting to take some sort of proto-racial character. Actually, the idea of the noble blood and all this stuff was believed because the elite started to believe that it was actually a sort of natural selection for their primacy, for their superiority. They were believing that they were intrinsically superior beings than the others, even though obviously Christian society tended to push the other stance, but this feeling was very strong and probably was rooted in some Indo-European perspective. Surely the old Europeans, the Aryans, believed that the stronger had the right to rule and to impose with his force, because it was believed, in fact, that force was given by the celestial deity of the sky, so that you couldn't achieve victory of superiority or mastery without a divine order. So basically you were justified and legitimized. That's how those populations had basically absorbed and kind of processed the thing, how to legitimate that. And so now in the Middle Ages, probably something was alive of that, but at the same time the same local the social conditions with the vassalatic beneficiary system were bringing to this maybe the re-evocation, the reenactment of such ideas, like the idea that the nobility was something intrinsically superior. And it's plenty of sources that state that peasants were barely considered as human beings. They were considered like half animals, something like that. So these are very interesting cultural perspectives, but we don't, unfortunately, we really don't know how true they are. I mean, how we can measure them. And one big problem is, in fact, that, as we were saying before, it's only the clergy that wrote. The knights didn't write. The peasants didn't write. So we don't really know what knights believed. We definitely know a bit better what knights believed compared to peasants, but definitely their voice, especially in this century, is really not known. We know about the clergy, and the clergy naturally at this time wrote with certain patterns of interpretation, with certain schemes, with certain models. Sometimes are even classicals, are of course from fathers of the church or from the Bible in itself, actually. So it's difficult for us what the everyday beliefs of the average European at the time actually were. There is another aspect about this tripartition that is very interesting, is that the inherent conflictuality existing between, or tension between, the clergy and the warrior class. This was a very ancient rivalry because that you can see also in here in very different civilizations, not just the Aryan one. You can see it very easily in the Mesopotamian world, where basically the priesthood, the clergy, basically tended to humiliate at a certain point the local ruler, telling them that basically they were always subordinated to deity, of which the priesthood was the depository of. And this is something actually very humbling and probably socially productive in a certain sense, but there's always this idea that you can spot even in the Middle Ages, that there is a great contrast between the sacerdotium and the imperium, right? Think about the clash for investitures. This is between Gregory the Seventh and Henry the Fourth. That's more evident. Who had to rule, the clergy or the military? Was it the papacy or the empire? This was pretty alive. So there's all this interpretation. Is actually, as you understand, it's very thought-provoking. It's very fascinating, very intriguing. But that we read through sources that are very stylized and patterned in a fashion that of which we can spot the very pragmatic intent, but behind which we can't really full read the whole thing. I mean, what is the Gregory the Seventh or Henry the Fourth really believed about themselves, about the papacy, about the empire, about who had to rule? Never underestimate that. One of the greatest differences that exists between us and those people is that we are very secular-minded beings. We have also a very theoretical level of thinking that kind of takes over the pragmatic one. Those people were kind of the other way around. They were extremely pragmatic, but at the same time they truly believed that the deity really encompassed and controlled and permeated the whole world, that everything was based on this real intervention of the divinity into every earthly affair. So even if you were from one side or another, there was probably a very strong and inner moral tension between these two systems. You can see the clergy versus the empire like something like Romanism versus Germanism, or because at the origin even those words were all the same, were all one, and in part this stems also from the outside of Europe, the European elements, but also from the biblical one, because also in the Bible you find basically the same exact problem. That this continuous struggle between the earthly ruler and God. Just think about Israel. That Israel literally means those who struggle with God. So basically, the chosen people of God in the Bible is also the one that has the greatest problem with him, that fights that. And this is a great and very deep metaphor that has naturally to do with the moral challenges that life entails, and that's how mankind basically expressed this problem in this great works of civilization. So it's these are problems that we don't pose to ourselves anymore. But for those people, everything was the whole world was about basically. So whichever perspective you wanna embrace, Dumezil's theory, however, today is not universally accepted, to say the least, let's say. And naturally, there are certain argumentations that have been brought up, fairly enough, pointing out certain faults of this system, and we have also partly listed. So, first of all, some criticize the general existence of a actual, of an Indo-European stock that you can define in a unique ethno-linguistical fashion. Like, that all these populations basically held the same exact beliefs and the same exact social systems. This is very difficult to tell, to prove historically. However, even if this system is not accepted in its in its broader in its complex, let's say, it's certain observations made on the European societies in this central centuries of the Middle Ages, as we have seen, remain very interesting and have influenced actually the work even of great scholars, including great medievalist of the 20th century, Georges Dumezil, that seem effectively to describe, accurately enough, certain forms, at least of self-representation of that society, especially starting from the ones elaborated from the clergy at that point. This is very important to stress, especially for this period, like the 11th century, those feudal world, it was really the clergy who wrote about, who fought to write about this and to elaborate some theory around this, something complex system, etc. So that's mainly the perspective that we get. It's the ecclesiastical one. And as we were saying before, they were the only ones who wrote down things, so it's pretty normal. And the fairest assessment you can make is that these societies, in reality, could as well be way more complex than how this tripartite system designated, drew them. Sorry, and this complexity was to take over, actually, in a very few time, to basically render irrecognizable, or at least very difficultly recognizable, such model into real society, like the one that was traced and even wished by the Bishop of Laon. Naturally, just imagine that all the propagandistic, the celebrative, the wishful perspective from which this was done. It's obvious that I can't say that this tripartite model existed, but as a matter of fact, it doesn't. It's like, even in our world, there are certain interpretations that of our own reality that evidently can be profitably criticized. And I must say that for that few that I've seen from anthropology during my studies, I realized that every society is very different. I mean, it's very fascinating to spot common points, and there are, because we're all humans. But I believe what it was more fascinating, and the thing towards which anthropology is more oriented now, it's actually tearing apart the interpretations that have been given, the categorical, let's say, interpretation have been given by the, by these social sciences that actually were born pretty late, so that made progress, let's say, in a late stage of our, in kind of a later than other fields, than our humanities. I mean, history was naturally something that speeded, that grew much earlier than anthropology. Anthropology is something that it's mostly from the 20th century that it emerged. So sometimes it was approximative. I mean, the anxiety of defining was brought to these categorizations, but today we realize that these things do not work anymore. Certain societies are impossible to frame into similar systems there without approximating, making brutal, even misunderstandings of what those peoples really believed, because this is actually at the moment our own real concern, is to understand how these people thought. That is possibly the most difficult challenge of every historical work, and probably our greatest cause of misunderstanding of the past. It's not about the interpretation of of a material datum. It's really how people thought. That is a very difficult exercise that we will never know, actually, because we don't even know how our neighbor really thinks. So can imagine peoples that lived 1,000, 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's so complicated. Albeit you can always find points in common, as actually something that we think today is definitely something that they also believed at the time. That actually comes from there, from same time. So, but whichever interpretation you want to give to this, as we're saying now, things changed pretty quickly. I mean, this idea of tripartite order came to collapse, to degenerate pretty quickly in the 12th century, especially because this society really transformed itself, and especially accelerated a lot into different directions, and created problems of interpretation of this idea. Because, for instance, think about the Oratores and the Laboratories. Think about the relation in the clergy with work. So there were some mystics out there, for instance, but also kind of workers. Think about the Cistercians. The Cistercian monks were all about working and actual work, and this is something actually that stemmed from, as we were saying before, from the Benedictine rule. I mean, what you have to do, ora et labora, in that motto you have the two things at the time. So those were monks. These were meant to be oratores, but they were laboratories as well. So how do you frame them? Or think about the same warrior monks. The religious / military orders that were made, which basically had knights, were also monks. Well, how do you classify them? Are they oratores or bellatores? In that case, it's very difficult to know. But especially there was something even more different than that, and that stemmed from the institutional level. That was the one of the world of the city. Recently we have been talking often about the rise of the cities, of communal civilization, and all this stuff that is very important and deeply overlooked, I believe. And the city really changed much of this. First of all, there is to say that not all, I mean, it's not a surprise that when we're quoting an individual like Adalberon of Laon, because Adalberon of Laon is a bishop in the most feudal country in Europe at this time. That is France. That is the kingdom of the Western Franks, as it is still called. And that was really the beating heart of feudalism. That was producing this tripartite conception of society, because it worked effectively, because it worked particularly well as a propagandistic picture for describing that society. But what about this time Anglo-Saxon England? Or what about the Iberian Peninsula? It is still largely under Muslim rule aside, but what about the kingdom of the Eastern Franks, where feudalism, vassalic beneficiary system, something that has barely had built its roots on it? What about Italy, where the feudal system is effectively crumbling because of the rise of the cities, in fact? What about Scandinavia? or Eastern Europe. What's the view in here? It's way more difficult to tell, because a kingdom like France, from this institutional figures that the clergy now also represented as bishops, archbishops, that were close to the crown, etc., expressed those ideas. But what about other places that maybe wrote even more than France, like Italy, for instance, and where, however, there wasn't really quite of a feudal monarchy, a functioning one at least. There was feudalism, but now this was, growing. There was the competition of cities, of trade activities, of markets, maritime trade, and what was the mindset there? And one problem in the historiographical production of the Middle Ages is also this matter of perspective. That sometimes when you have a central government, a big government, like in the case of the big monarchies, etc., you may have this actually more structural views of the world, because there is someone who is generally paid by the king, who writes, therefore, on behalf of the king's cause and view of the world from a political point of view, and is able to elaborate that. Maybe he's a very highly educated person that, however, has a very elitary education. But if you look at other parts of the world where maybe there is a more political, maybe there is even a greater wealth and a greater political fragmentation, or maybe people are poorer, and there is still a political fragmentation, you may realize that in those worlds there is no one who is effectively paid for writing such things, and therefore they tell you overall, maybe even more sources are produced, but they do not tell the story from that omnicomprehensive kind of propagandistic picture of how the state should be about. This is particularly important because we often get only the perspective of those sources that we have, and we forget about the rest. We forget about the rest of the world. Sometimes of a very close world that sometimes you don't even have to go much, even outside the boundaries of that specific country to find. Think about the differences that existed now in the French kingdom, from the Channel to the Mediterranean. They were very different cultures, even languages that were spoken about. Occitans, Langue d'Oil, Languedoc. So what it's particularly meaningful not to think that what we have is all that mattered at the time, because as a matter of fact, most of what we have from that world is kind of a minority review relatively to all the amount of the rest of the population. Without mentioning that some political entities have been wiped out, and that's also pretty meaningful, meaning that they could have left us more thinking about but not even because of intentional destruction, but just thinking about fires, archives burning. It's unfortunately very sad, but it happened a lot, and that's vital to bear in mind when you make history, when you write history, because that absence matters a lot. It's the city that really changes, however, a lot of this system, because the city, first of all, becomes an administrative center. So it becomes a place that starts kind of reasoning a bit on its own. Even outside the monarchical perspective, it kind of becomes a thing about the city-states that emerge at this point, and that come to discuss the traditional schemes. And what is very interesting from this source is that you can see very well from that sometimes the allegiance to the feudal hierarchies was pretty loose. That they were recognized, that they maybe recognized that there was an empire, was a kingdom, but they still wrote about something else. They wrote about what they truly cared about, that most of the time was not that. They cared about their trade, they cared about their wars, and they didn't give they didn't have that overall comprehension. And from that perspective, there's a bit of a middle ground between the rest of the population, the wide majority of and the elite, because it effectively stayed in the middle, even in the social ladder. And you can see in here that probably from this progression, probably the peasantry didn't even understand what was going on from that point of view. They knew that maybe a lot, maybe just about the local lordship, but they didn't have, probably didn't even have the intellectual means to understand much beyond that. Things like kingdoms and empires and theological, deep institutional, political, and theological questions. They didn't give a damn. All they were thinking about was surviving. To work hard, because that was the only way they could feed their own families and to pay the Lord and to maybe save that little thing that, by the way, at the end of their lives, seemingly on average in the Middle Ages, wasn't even perceived. Like, that was so few that they actually managed to save after a lifetime of work. So just think about how that shapes and molds your mindset. It's dramatic, actually, and you're obviously concentrated on it, because there are not many other ways you can think about else. But just think about especially the city as a place of differentiation of work. So, for instance, the Laboratories that we meant before were in the Bishop of Laon's mind were chiefly the peasants, right? So those who worked the land. But the city had a lot of workers, as we understand, but they were kind of specialized workers. There were people like merchants, bankers, artisans, but also kind of, they were more similar to producers. Like, there were new categories of producers, similar to in this mainly economical goal, but there were now new professionals of intellectual activities, like doctors and notaries. And therefore, how can you think about these new classes that, by the way, were also extremely close to the elites at this point, because people like doctors, like notaries, they were used by kings and princes. There were people who lived at court sometimes. And how can you, or together with the church, by the way, so how can you frame them among the Laboratories, for instance? It's very complicated to do it, and evidently this system is pretty difficult to imagine, if not just an ideal, right? There was also a lot of mobility. And the city is very fascinating to this, because in the cities you find all of these elements together. Like in the feudal world, you have the castle, where there are the Bellatores, the monasteries, and where there are the Oratores, and the country, where there are the peasants. Right, and of course, even in there, even the castles and monasteries were in the countryside, but still, they were even kind of ideally different physical places, right? When you are in the city, the city takes over, and you're basically in the city together with many other people who are different from you, or maybe that, are different from you in a measure, but they're kind of all citizen. There's also this new municipal ideal that starts, but definitely the city is way less static than the feudal world and then the rural world, so that within the same city walls you can find urban aristocracies of various extraction, knights that became citizens, rustics that are transformed into bourgeoisie, into burghers fundamentally. and that all live all together in this very close urban space. So even in there, it's obvious that when you make people living together, they're gonna somewhat influence each other. That there is a hybrid, there is a new culture, new identity forming, right? And this is what the city produces effectively in those centuries. So it's at this point that the inequalities and the contradictions couldn't be, hypocritically hidden. Like at that point, it was obvious, and even in the city became battlefields in this sense. There was a very strong clash even between the aristocracy, the commoners, depending on the interests, but also in here there were many intersections. So the city came to blend all these things in, and in many ways modern Europe is effectively born from the cities. It's born from city-states, from the Renaissance, from this world that was way more secular in mindset, because it had been able to go beyond that this tripartite order, and observing that reality was way more complex than that. But even in the feudal world, as we have seen, the tripartite order was probably just a perspective, an idea of owned by certain specific elements, chiefly the clergy, or however someone who was pushing for that ideal to be reached, but this ideal didn't actually correspond to society in practice, and it's pretty obvious for every ideal. So there is this other paradox, let's say, is that the so-called troisième état, the third estate, that is formed by those producers that fundamentally that will survive as such. I mean, there will always it will remain intact till the end of the 18th century as this great mass of people that at one point came to basically be like the 98% of the world population. That especially towards the end of the modern age, now with this long Middle Ages, if you want to think like that in the Ancien Regime, naturally had become definitely just a name, and so in itself different universe. There was the bourgeoisie, there was peasantry that had, the first, the 18th century revolutions were chiefly bourgeois revolutions. Like, it's pretty evident. And so that even in there were the middle classes that wanted this kind of liberal revolution for making them participate to politics and have more prerogatives. It's not that they gave a damn about the peasants. Let's be honest about that. And therefore you realize how many differences in this idea that were that however allow to reflect on how what that system was in particular. And that's, I believe, the most interesting aspect about the whole story in here, that it's obvious that every pattern of interpretation that you want to give is kind of inaccurate for everything in history. You can't. We go by approximation in every single thing we do, and single thing we describe for every single narrative. But at the same time, it's criticizing these patterns that helps us paradoxically to gain a more accurate and better and comprehensive and multifaceted perspective of the world, and that increases our accuracy and gives that extra more that we need to approach these topics from. So okay, then I believe this is more or less what I wanted to say, and there is a lot, as you understand, to address when talking about these topics, and I believe that we must necessarily go in depth. As I was saying yesterday, I don't really know how much it will take to complete all this kind of manualistic level of history introductions, let's say, historical introductions on Schwerpunkt, but I think they are useful. I mean, for anyone who at least wants to approach these problems, that more or less this is the perspective. I don't go much in detail, also because I don't know much myself, but it's still about the perspective. I mean, if you remain flexible with the perspective, then you can learn everything else that you want and then go in depth. So this is more or less how even university works, actually, because you can't pretend just to overload people with data, but without telling them how to interpret them, because otherwise, it can start from that too, and actually there should be both things at the same time. So that my idea is that we're in fact heading too much towards the interpretation, so towards the theoretical, and abandoning the pragmatism. That is this historical trend that we're noticing before it was happening. But this is the reason why I talk slightly more in depth than what a basic medieval class would be, right? So that we try to add even that kind of notionistic element that can help, but still, I think the perspective, if you're just someone starting to learn history, it's important, can help, and that's all I care, to be of help, fundamentally. And so, okay, for now, it's all. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.